Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Funnel Trade. So it is time once again for my favorite video every time it comes up on my Kanban board to do a refresh. Yes, it is the 6-month update on the long-term Pokemon booster box prices, which every time I do this, I absolutely love it because it just underscores with objective math how ridiculously good Pokemon boxes do in the long term and how long they have been achieving those gains and how recently they've even been accelerating beyond the incredible past performance we've measured before. So let's go over to the chart. I'll explain everything about it and we'll start looking at the numbers. So what we do is we say, what would the compound annual growth rate be of each of these boxes going all the way back to the black and white era of 2011? What would that compound annual growth rate be if we had to purchase it on release day, which historically is the worst day to purchase a box because you don't get the kind of discounts that you get later in life according to the TCG expansion life cycle. But if you had to buy it on release day and you paid $100 per box, we're going to still go with $100 per box because all the way through the Sword and Shield era, that was actually very reasonable. You could get just about every box through the Sword and Shield era for around $100 during their in print lifetime. So if you bought them on that date at $100 per box, well, today, October 5th, 2025, if they are whatever price we measure on TCG Player, what is the compound annual growth rate that comes out of that? And CAGR is a good measurement because it reduces the entire lifetime performance of an asset down to a single number. So it strips out the time period so you can compare different assets' performances over different length time periods, over different time periods that don't line up, and it pulls out the value in the sense that if you had one thing that went from $2 to $10 in a time period, it would evaluate the same as something that went from $2 million to $10 million in the same length time period. So we go through and we solve what is today's CAGR result given all of those assumptions. Oh, and by the way, I assume you pay 12.5% sales fees when you sell the item. Now, when I go to get the prices off of TCG Player, what I do is I look at market price first. So I'm seeing, are there enough recent sales for TCG Player to give us a market price? And the reason I do that is that that reflects actual real price discovery in the market. It reflects people who actually clicked the buy button and gave money to get the product and what price they were willing to pay. That's price discovery, and that's the most high quality piece of data you can use. Now, TCG Player has certain rules for when they will and won't produce a market price. If something has not sold recently enough, they will no longer produce a market price. So in those cases, I say, what is the lowest ask price that is being asked by sellers who have the product available? And so if there's no market data and I'm looking at the lowest ask price, I highlight it in yellow. And then sometimes these boxes, they just flat out disappear. Not enough of them exist anymore for them to come up for sale on TCG Player. And for those, I just highlight it red. There are no data for those. Now, I also have Pokemon Center listed on here. There have been times in the past on previous 6-month updates of these data where boxes were available on Pokemon Center, and I use those prices because they sell for MSRP, which is typically cheaper than the actual market price. So as we come in and we look at that, we see the black and white era of 2011 through 2013. And most of these boxes have disappeared now. Out of the 12, 10 of them have disappeared. Only one of them had a market price reflecting that enough boxes had sold in a reasonable past length of time to generate a market price of $4,800. Now, when you do the calculation, if you had to buy them in May of 2013 and you sold it today on October 5th, 2025, You had bought it at $100, you sold it at 4,800, your compound annual growth rate would have been 35.1% for this box over its entire lifetime. The benchmark we compare to is typically the S&P 500, which if you buy S&P 500 index ETFs, you'll get somewhere on the long timeline of about 8 to 10 to 12% per year return. Now, those returns from the S&P have been higher in more recent years due to inflation and a lot of post-COVID money printing. So on the long timeline, though, 8 to 10 to 12% is what you would expect. So this box returned 35%. And remember, this is compounding annual growth rate. So for every one of the approximately 12 years in between release and today, its price went up 35% more every year. So for legendary treasures here, we do not have any market sales data. All we had was the lowest ask price, and there was the lowest, cheapest box for sale was $21,990. We don't really like those numbers highlighted in yellow because they don't reflect actual sales. All they reflect is an ask price from a seller. That's why we like the market data. The market prices reflect actual sales. So we'll go on to the XY era because we have a lot better data here. But even here, the data are just beginning on this 6-month update to start having these yellow and red boxes. It's the first time they've come into the XY era, but we're going to see that more and more over time every 6 months as I continue to update this series. And what we'll see is that more of these boxes just become unobtainable. But we get data for a lot more, 11 out of 12 of the boxes. And you can see the compound annual growth rates ranging between the low 20s up to the low 50s. So ancient origins boxes have increased in value over 50% compounding every year since their release. I took an average here of these CAGRs. It's just a simple arithmetic mean. You would technically do an internal rate of return to correctly compute the average of compound annual growth rates. I don't do that here because we're really not trying to simulate having bought every one of these boxes in equal proportions. We're just looking at what is the average overall. So an arithmetic mean is kind of good enough. But overall average compound annual growth rate for the XY era right now is 36%. Remember, that compares to our benchmark S&P 500 performance of about 12%. The best was 51, the second best was 46. I go ahead and compute the second best and the second worst just to chop off the top and bottom outliers, just so we get something a little more reasonable near the center. And the absolute worst performer, 21.9%. Going forward into the sun and moon era, same kind of things. You see that the best was 89.7% compound annual growth rate. That is unbelievable. That is like if you knew Mark Zuckerberg in college and he got you to invest in Facebook. Those are the kind of returns you would have expected, is 90% compound annual growth rate as Facebook grew over the 2010s and consumed social media. 17.8% as the worst, still well higher than the S&P 500. And if we take those second best and second worst, we'll range from 23% compound annual growth rate to 72%. And here in the sun and moon era, we have good data for every box. We have a market price that's composed of data from actual recent sales. So we have good recent price discovery. And then coming forward again into the sword and shield era, we see that we range 115.7% compound annual growth rate for our beloved Evolving Skies. It has more than doubled in price every year since it was released, August of 2021. The worst performer, 17.5%. That's Vivid Voltage. And then Battle Styles should be pretty close. Yeah, Battle Styles and Darkness Ablaze. So all three of these here not performing that well, down in the low 20s and the high teens. Second best to second worst is 90% all the way down to about 22%. So you see, over the long time periods, how well Pokemon booster boxes do. And again, this assumes you bought on the worst day. You tied up your money as quickly as possible as soon as it released into the market. You got it at $100 a box, which for most of these boxes during the Sword and Shield era, they were selling below wholesale price delivered to your house. I started buying Fusion Strike boxes at about $93. So these are very, very conservative assumptions. They assume you had to pay a 12.5% selling fee when you theoretically sold these boxes, and still, here are the returns. So there's two numbers sitting off here to the side, and I will explain what these are and how I calculated them. So the first one, 24.9, and I will show you the formula here for anyone who wants to go back and double check me. But essentially, the question that I asked was, if Evolving Skies today stopped going up in price and it held the current $2,685 per booster box price, it just held that price steady into the future, how many years would it take before the compound annual growth rate of that product fell all the way to that 12% S&P 500 benchmark? And so it would take an additional 24.9 years from today for it to fall if the price of Evolving Skies never ticks up another dollar. It will take 24.9 years before the CAGR of the product stretches out to the point where it equals that 12% S&P 500 benchmark. It would have to do nothing price-wise for 25 years. And this second number here, show the formula on that if anybody would like to double check it or anything else. Someone sent me a link recently with another YouTube creator, and there was a comment in the video, a comment on the video from somebody saying that Evolving Skies would go to $10,000 in the next 5 years. And the content creator emphatically declared unequivocally that no, it won't. It will not go to $10,000 in the next 5 years. And I looked at that and I thought, well, we don't have to just declare things. We have mathematics we can use to solve this, to better understand the claim that it will go to $10,000 in 5 years or that it won't. And so what I've done here is I've said, what would the compound annual growth rate need to be of Evolving Skies starting at $2,685 per box today and rising to $10,000 per box 5 years from now? What CAGR would be required in order to achieve that? And it's 30.1%. That's what you get. So if Evolving Skies from today, October 5th, 2025, can achieve at least a 30.1% compound annual growth rate for the next 5 years on average, it will hit $10,000 per box 5 years from today, October 5th, 2030. And in order for it to not make $10,000 5 years from today, the compound annual growth rate has to be below 30.1%. And we can just simply look at our historical data that we've been collecting for years now, and we can say, what is the compound annual growth rate of Evolving Skies so far in its whole lifetime? 115.7%. And so this product would have to begin performing very, very badly. You see, the average of Sword and Shield era booster box performance is 51% CAGR. In fact, you have to go and start performing like Sword and Shield Base or Rebel Clash, and you can see how many of these products still perform above 30.1%. So you would have to start performing worse, Evolving Skies that is, would have to start performing worse than Chilling Reign, than Fusion Strike, than Brilliant Stars, than Astral Radiance, than Lost Origins, and then Silver Tempest, in order for it to begin performing so badly as 30.1% compound annual growth rate, which it would have to consistently perform that poorly for the next 5 years in order to not hit $10,000 a box 5 years from now. So be very skeptical when you have people out there unequivocally stating that things will or will not happen, and they never use data, they never show math, they never bring receipts. They simply argue and make authoritative claims with nothing to back them up. So I do this every 6 months because I think it's interesting to just see how are these boxes still doing? Because we've been told by a lot of content creators on YouTube, not just in investment space, but in general financial space, that this kind of stuff can't happen, that this kind of performance is not possible. It was never meant to be like this. Markets don't work like this. It can't go on this way. And yet here we are. The total average compound annual growth rate of all these 4 eras of Pokemon booster boxes for the boxes for which there are sufficient data to do the calculations, it's 44.7%. And over the long timeline, we keep seeing these same results again and again every time we've measured them. There's something interesting that I don't usually show in these videos, but I keep all the historical data over here. And I do a couple other calculations that I keep to myself. And I'll show you one right here. It's this column, AF, column AF. And what column AF is telling us is between the last two updates, so between the update I did in April of this year and this update today in October, if we were to take the change in price over that approximate 6 month period, and we were to do a compound annual growth rate calculation on it, what rate have the box prices been growing at simply over the last 6 months? And these are the numbers. And then I have it do a conditional formatting where it changes the color of the cells if that rate is higher than its historical rate. So what that means is these boxes will be colored this greenish blue color if the box price appreciation is accelerating. So if it's going up faster and faster over the last 6 months than it has historically over the rest of its life. And what do we see as we slowly scroll up here? Every single box for which we have sufficient data to do the calculation has accelerated in price gain over the last 6 months. So keep that in mind if you end up on some dark corner of YouTube where somebody is telling you that markets don't work this way, it can't go on like this, and it was never meant to be like this. These are the objective data. We go and we take measurements from the market, we do math on them, we show our formulas, we show our work, and we come back and we update it again and again every 6 months. So I'll do another update like this 6 months from now, this coming April of 2026. And I will probably start adding the Scarlet and Violet era boxes. Compound annual growth rate calculations get kind of weird on too short of a time scale. And so I don't like to add boxes that are still too new. We're probably at the point where early Scarlet and Violet era boxes will give good, reasonable numbers, and the later ones will still be very crazy. Because when you have something like the latter boxes that are $350 right now, it's going to tell you things like the compound annual growth rate is 500%. And technically that's correct. But we know that that kind of performance will level out over time. So I generally like to avoid that instead of trying to explain it away by explaining compound annual growth rate better. So let me know what you think, guys. I'll do this every 6 months forever, and we'll see if markets were actually meant to work this way. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.